Title: DNA Secrets from the Phoenician Ancestors. This is the story of what happened when scientists finally read the DNA of the Phoenicians, and how the answer overturned an assumption historians had clung to for centuries. For thousands of years, these people were remembered as the great traders of the ancient Mediterranean, and nearly everyone took it for granted that their far-flung colonies were packed with their own descendants. The DNA tells a very different story. Before the genetics can mean anything, you need a sense of who these people actually were. The Phoenicians were a Semitic people of the Levant, descended from Canaanite cultures that had lived in the region since at least 2000 BC. Here is the strange part. We do not actually know what they called themselves, because the name Phoenician came from outsiders, mostly the Greeks, while the people themselves may have gone by the older term Canaanite. Their homeland hugged the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, across what is now Lebanon, and stretching into parts of Syria and Israel. Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre stood as the chief cities, joined by Beirut, the place we call Beirut today. And this next detail shapes the whole story, because Phoenicia never became a single unified empire. What existed instead was a league of independent city-state ports, each one its own seat of power, held together by a shared culture rather than one central government. That culture went on to mark the entire world. 22 letters made up the Phoenician alphabet, and it was already in use at Byblos as far back as the 15th century BCE. Carved into the sarcophagus of Ahiram, around 1200 BCE, sits the earliest known inscription written in it. When the Greeks borrowed this system, it grew into the ancestor of the modern Latin alphabet, the very letters in front of you right now. Their spoken language, Phoenician, ran close to Hebrew and Aramaic. Trade is what truly made their name. Out of that string of port cities flowed wood, cloth, dyes, embroideries, wine, and decorative objects, and buyers across the ancient world prized their ivory carving and their metalwork. Wherever they sailed, they planted colonies, and the greatest of them rose on the North African coast, in what is now Tunisia, a city called Carthage. Scholars use the word Punic for this Western world centered on Carthage, the Roman term for these Western Phoenicians, and Carthage eventually grew powerful enough to stand as Rome's fiercest rival. So picture the assumption historians carried for generations. Phoenician culture, language, and religion had clearly fanned out across the Mediterranean, from Lebanon to North Africa to Sicily, Sardinia, Iberia, and further still. The obvious conclusion was that the spread worked the way most ancient expansions were imagined, with Phoenician people themselves settling each place and filling it with their own bloodline. Testing that idea directly stayed impossible for a very long time. Then ancient DNA arrived and rewrote the rules. The first crack appeared in 2016. A team co-led by Professor Lisa Matisoo-Smith of the University of Otago in New Zealand pulled off the first complete mitochondrial genome ever recovered from Phoenician remains. Their subject was a young man laid to rest in Carthage roughly 2,500 years ago, remembered now as the young man of Bursa, or simply Ariche. Because mitochondrial DNA passes down only through the mother, it traces a single unbroken maternal line back through the centuries. What surfaced in Ariche caught everyone off guard. His maternal lineage belonged to a rare European haplogroup called U5B2C1, one of the most ancient haplogroups on the entire continent, tied to its early hunter-gatherer populations. Finding that European maternal signature in a man buried on the coast of North Africa was a genuine shock. As Matisoo-Smith noted, this stood as the earliest evidence of haplogroup U5B2C1 anywhere in North Africa, with its arrival dated to at least the late 6th century BC. The specifics only sharpen the puzzle. Ariche's mitochondrial makeup lined up most closely with a living individual from Portugal, steering his maternal roots toward the northern Mediterranean coast, most likely the Iberian Peninsula. Then the researchers checked him against 47 modern Lebanese people, drawn from the very heartland of ancient Phoenicia, and not a single one carried his U5B2C1 line. The first Phoenician ever sequenced, buried inside the Phoenician colony of Carthage, turned out to carry a European maternal lineage that his supposed homeland did not share. A single person, though, is only one thread in a much larger weave, so the team kept pulling. 2018 brought a broader study from Matasu Smith and her colleagues, including the geneticist Pierre Zalloua, this time reaching across 14 new ancient mitochondrial sequences. Some came from pre-Phoenician samples dating to around 1800 BCE. Others from the Phoenician period between roughly 700 and 400 BCE, with 4 drawn from Lebanon and 10 from Sardinia. Those results traced a story of movement and mixing at the Phoenician community of Monte Sirai on Sardinia. Several local lineages carried straight through, which meant indigenous Sardinians were being folded into the settlement rather than pushed out of it. Right alongside that continuity came entirely new lineages, the fingerprints of women arriving from the Near East, from North Africa, and quite possibly from Europe as well. The researchers even caught signs of European women moving into Phoenician sites back in Lebanon. Everything pointed toward female mobility and real genetic diversity, communities assembled through migration and cultural blending rather than one people simply copying itself onto foreign soil. Before we follow the trail further west, the homeland deserves a second look, because its DNA carries a striking story of its own. In 2017, a team that included Mark Haber and Pierre Zalloua sequenced 5 whole genomes from people who lived in Sidon. Around 3,700 years ago, back in the Canaanite era that gave rise to the Phoenicians. They set those ancient genomes beside 99 people living in Lebanon today, and the comparison came back with rare clarity. More than 90% of the genetic ancestry of modern Lebanese people flows directly from those ancient Canaanites. Sit with what that figure implies. Across roughly 4,000 years, through waves of empires, invasions, and staggering upheaval, the population of the Phoenician homeland held remarkably steady. National Geographic framed it as identifying the living descendants of the biblical Canaanites. In the east, in Lebanon, the thread running from the ancient Phoenician world to the present day is real, and it is direct. That continuity is exactly what makes the next discovery so jarring, because out west, the thread nearly vanishes. This is the study that reset the entire field, published in the journal Nature in April of 2025. Led by Harold Ringbauer and joined by the Harvard geneticist David Reich. This time, the evidence went far beyond a scatter of maternal lineages. The team generated genome-wide data for 210 individuals, 196 of them from 14 sites long identified as Phoenician and Punic, reaching across the Levant, North Africa, Iberia, Sicily, Sardinia, and Ibiza, with the 6th through 2nd centuries BCE in focus. Their central finding cut straight against the old assumption. Levantine Phoenicians, it turned out, made little genetic contribution to the Punic settlements of the central and western Mediterranean, even with all the archaeological evidence of shared culture, history, language, and religion binding those places together. The people carrying Phoenician culture across the sea were, for the most part, not blood descendants of the Phoenician homeland at all. So whose ancestry were they carrying? Rather than a Levantine profile, these inheritors of Phoenician culture drew most of their ancestry from a genetic profile close to that of Sicily and the Aegean, with much of what remained tracing to North Africa, a reflection of Carthage and its growing reach. The Punic populations came back, in the study's own language, as highly heterogeneous, a genuinely mixed body of peoples instead of one tidy bloodline. The researchers did not hedge about the meaning. As Harold Ringbauer put it, their results mean that people of non-Levantine ancestries must have adopted Levantine Phoenician culture, including its language and religion, and that Phoenician culture stayed open to integrating outsiders. Pierre Zalloua, who had chased these questions across nearly a decade of studies, distilled it into a single line. Phoenicians, he said, were a culture of integration and assimilation, and they settled where they sailed. Here is the beating heart of the whole story, and it dissolves what first looks like a flat contradiction. The archaeology, the language, and the religion all shout strong Phoenician connections spanning the Mediterranean. The genetics answer that those connections were never mainly about shared ancestry. Phoenician identity traveled as culture, not as bloodline. Their success grew out of a restless process of cultural transmission and assimilation, rather than any mass movement of one population. And coverage of the study cast the Punic world as one of the first truly cosmopolitan civilizations, a network stitched together by shared culture instead of shared descent. All of this means a word like descendants needs handling with care. Out in the eastern homeland, in Lebanon, the genetic continuity is real and measurable, with more than 90% of modern Lebanese ancestry reaching back to the ancient Canaanites. Across the Western colonial world, the Punic populations were diverse and largely non-Levantine, so the path back to the Phoenician homeland is anything but a straight line. Phoenician ancestors mean one thing on the shores of Lebanon and something quite different in the harbors of Carthage. One more caution belongs in the picture as this research rolls forward. The early studies, back in 2016 and 2018, leaned on mitochondrial DNA alone, which follows only the maternal line, and they worked from small samples. The 2025 study drew on genome-wide data across a far larger group of people. Each method captures something true, yet they answer slightly different questions. And the fullest picture only comes into view when you read them together. So pull back and take in everything the DNA has surrendered. The first Phoenician ever sequenced carried a European maternal line his homeland never shared. Colonies on Sardinia absorbed the locals and welcomed women from across the sea. The homeland in Lebanon still holds a genetic thread stretching back 4,000 years. And the great Western world of Carthage revealed itself as a diverse, cosmopolitan blend that owed little of its ancestry to the Levant. History remembered the Phoenicians as traders who carried goods across the ancient world, and it turns out they carried something far more potent than cargo. What they moved was a culture anyone could take up, in any port, no matter their blood. That was the real Phoenician secret, and it took ancient DNA thousands of years later to finally bring it into the light.